Welcome to the Oak Lodge Governance Project's presentation today. We have been working for well over 2 years trying to get our community valid, useful information about our local area, its history and its type of government, and the options for other forms of representation. You can find most all of the facts and presentations available on our self-funded website, which will appear in the chat. Thank you, Cole or Nathan, right now. And shall I turn it over to our speaker, or are we having an introduction? Valerie, would you take it?
Thank you, Jane. So our speaker this morning is Kenneth R Coleman, who will speak on the topic of racial exclusion in pre-statehood Oregon. Mr. Coleman is a local writer, a musician, and historian with an emphasis on class and racial formation in the 19th century Pacific Northwest. He received a Master of Arts in History from Portland State University and currently teaches U.S. history at Portland Community College. His first book, Dangerous Subjects, James D. Saules and the Rise of Black Exclusion, won the Francis Fuller Victor Award for General Nonfiction at the 2019 Oregon Book Awards. In 2020, he received the Michael P. Malone Award from the Western Historical Association for the best article, essay, or commentary on state, provincial, or territorial history. Well, we'd like to ask you this morning, when you have questions, to please put them in the chat box, and that way we will collect them together and have Mr. Coleman answer them at the appropriate time. So with that, I am pleased now to introduce to you Kenneth Coleman.
So much for having me. Can everyone hear me? Is the audio clear? Excellent. Thank you for the thumbs up. I know most of you are probably on mute now. Yeah, I'm a historian of the Pacific Northwest. I'm also a teacher, and I think you'll see me wearing both of those hats today. I'm really interested in colonialism. I mean, as well as white supremacy and class formation, but colonialism is really going to dominate the talk today. And I'll just define it really quick as far as I understand it, that it's an imperialist tactic in which a polity, a kingdom or a nation establishes colonies in foreign territories. And that's really what we're going to, I mean, that's the crux of today. Also with this talk, I was thinking about how can I do a talk that doesn't, well, for instance, Walida Imarisha does a great talk that you may have seen called Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? And that's a topic that is really important. She does a wonderful job. And I was thinking, how can I do a talk that sort of complements her talk, but kind of goes in some different directions? So that's kind of the genesis of the talk I'm going to give today. So let me share my screen real quick. See this? Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen? Excellent, thank you so much. Okay, I'm a recovering PowerPoint addict, and I'm trying to wean myself off of it. I'm still going to use it today just a little bit. There's not going to be much text to look at. It's going to be more about images that sort of will serve as mnemonic devices for me as I give this talk. So again, as I said, I'm an educator. I like to align what I talk about with certain objectives. So I'm going to go over just some objectives of what I want to accomplish today. And why isn't the, oh, whoops. Elegantly unfold each bullet point. It didn't quite work out, but that's okay. So the objectives today, first of all, answer the question, why were Black exclusion laws so persistent in early Oregon history? I think it's an interesting question because in antebellum America, there really wasn't any indication that there was going to be any sort of huge migration of Black people to Oregon in general. There weren't that many Black people in Oregon sort of at the founding when it became sort of an American style government. So it's sort of weird because it seems like this obsession, a solution without a quote unquote problem. So that's one question I hope that we can answer. Secondly, how did local, territorial, and federal governments forge and maintain Black exclusion in Oregon. So we're going to look at kind of all of these because it wasn't just one law. It was a web of laws at sort of every level. Finally, I want to transcend Oregon exceptionalism to understand Black exclusion, not excuse it, but to understand why it happened. That's something I tell my students, that historians are here to understand the past, not to judge historical actors by our present standards. It's very tempting to do, but it doesn't really yield much. So we're gonna, hopefully by the end, we'll understand why Black exclusion was so persistent by examining both local and national context, and even sort of international context. So just real quick, Oregon exceptionalism. I'm a Pacific Northwest historian. I'm guilty of it. It means that we think Oregon is somehow inherently different than other places and somehow remarkable. And I think there's some truth to that. But it also means we have a temptation to bracket Oregon off from the rest of the country and indeed the rest of the world, and just sort of look at all of these issues in a regional vacuum. I see that all the time, even when people are talking about early Oregon history. So we're going to have to just widen the lens today. Black exclusion was not unique to Oregon. Sometimes I see people converse about it, that somehow this was something unique to Oregon. It's like a weird form of Oregon exceptionalism. It's not that people are proud of it, but you know what I mean? It's sort of like people are like, hey, look at this, look at what we had here. But it wasn't at all remarkable. You would find it everywhere, and we'll get into that more later. But it was carried out, Black exclusion was always carried out under really specific, unique local contexts. And we're going to examine those contexts today. My book about James D. Saules and why that's sort of important to the topic. This is sort of how I came to this topic. I wrote this weird book about James D. Saules, and I say it's weird because I didn't know much about him when I wrote it, and I still don't know that much about him now. But what little I did learn about him really, really fascinated me. James D. Saules was a Black sailor. He was probably from New Haven, Connecticut. He came to settle in Oregon permanently in 1841, which was 2 years before the Oregon Trail migrants first arrived. Make sure there weren't any issues. So a U.S. naval expedition called the Wilkes Expedition, or the U.S. Exploring Expedition. And this was a huge undertaking by the federal government. It's actually, it was originally the brainchild of John Quincy Adams. It was later carried out during the Jackson and Van Buren administrations. This was like the Lewis and Clark expedition writ large. So instead of just exploring the Louisiana Purchase, this expedition was exploring the entire world. And they were gone for 2 years. James Saules joined the expedition as a cook in Chile. A whole interesting story there. But what fascinated me about Saules was that Oregon's first and possibly second Black exclusion laws seemed to be inspired, or at least partially inspired, by him. And I also argue that, to understand his life and times is to understand sort of the nature of white supremacy and the virulence of white supremacy in Oregon at the time. I was also interested in doing a history of the non-elite, the ordinary person. So many books get written about presidents. I mean, just go look at the new history selections in any bookstore, and I guarantee you 70% of them will be yet another biography of a president. But I wanted to do something different. So I put Saules at the center of the story of early Oregon, of the colonization of Oregon, to understand the shifting nature of colonialism, and that there were actually many different types of colonialism going on at the time in Oregon, and these colonists weren't getting along. And Saules kind of gets put in the middle of all of this. And once the Oregon Trail migrants arrive, Saules really struggles to maintain his place in this rapidly changing landscape. It's also worth noting that It was British and American colonization of Oregon that introduced race, that introduced racism, the ideology of race. It didn't exist in the indigenous communities that resided in this region prior. So this is an import. This is a product of colonialism. Also brought men like Saules to the region. You could even think of him somehow as an agent of empire. The maritime industry was the #1 employer of free Black American men in the antebellum United States. Any sailing ship at the time, sailing almost anywhere in the world, would probably have had a crew of anywhere between 15 to 30% Black men. You see this if you read any old book about sailors. Read Moby Dick. I mean, this will become very obvious to you. I bring this up because for most people in Oregon at the time who were coming over on the Oregon Trail, that would have been their perception of a free Black man would have been a sailor, someone coming to Oregon, not on the Oregon Trail, not on a wagon or walking next to a wagon, but on a sailing ship. So that's something important to think about. Figured it out. I just have to click a different button. So really quick, when we talk about Oregon, we're talking about that area to the left, the Oregon country, which was not part of the United States. It was not part of Great Britain at the time we're talking about. It was sort of occupied by both in a really uncomfortable arrangement. Both the United States and Great Britain claimed to have possession, but they could never decide who actually had possession of this land. How did they have possession? Through the magic of the doctrine of discovery, which is a topic for another talk. But so we're talking about Oregon country was huge, pretty much encompassed all of British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and even parts of Montana and Wyoming. So, but most of what we're talking about today is about the Willamette Valley, the area I assume most of the people here today probably live in the Willamette Valley. So that's really geographically. Looking at this map, I just want to point out really quick is this is what the United States looked like in 1842. And you see it's that sort of beige area on the left. And then you have those brown areas, which are territories of the United States. They really shouldn't have put Oregon in that color. That was a huge mistake on this map. Another big mistake was not labeling Mexico. That's the enormous gray land to the south of Oregon. Okay, someone's saying the sound's cutting out. Let me know if that continues and I can try something different. And to the north there, that other gray area, that's British Canada. So this is the world we are going to be focusing on today. Let's just think about what Oregon was like when Saules, when I stopped talking. Well, maybe I just need to keep talking. It used to be a problem. Maybe I can use the computer. Okay, so let me take these off. Okay, how about now? Can you hear me now? Is this better?
That's great. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay. I tried to be clever with the AirPods and I outsmarted myself. So apologies to you all and whoever is watching this video in the future. So what world did James D. Saules come to when he deserted that U.S. naval expedition? Well, he came into the Oregon country, a world that the fur industry had created. So prior to the first major migration of American farm families in 1843, the region was really, at least non-indigenous Oregon, was dominated by the fur industry, in particular, the Hudson's Bay Company that was harvesting furs throughout Oregon and beyond. But the fur industry was really interesting because it's sort of
it's a form of colonialism that I think is familiar to you. I call it mercantile colonialism, in which, in this case, Britain charters a joint stock company. They go out to an area to extract natural resources, and in this instance, furs. They kind of use the local indigenous population as labor, and that's certainly what the Hudson's Bay Company did. The people actually getting the furs and trading the furs were local indigenous communities around Fort Vancouver. That's who was doing much of the actual work. But there was an interesting, sparsely populated, multi-ethnic community grows up around the fur trade. French Canadians, many of whom married indigenous women in the region. So you also have a lot of mixed race people, for lack of a better term, people of mixed ancestry. You have indigenous people from the East, like from the Iroquois Confederation, who know about harvesting furs and have come out here to work. You have some Brits, you have Pacific Islanders. There's an interesting Hawaiian influence in early Oregon as well. And then you kind of have people of all sorts of mixed ancestry, as I said before. So this is like a different trajectory than Oregon would develop later on. And this is kind of the world that the Oregon Trail is going to, in many ways, erase, and intentionally erase. So when James Saules comes to Oregon, he kind of settles right into this world, and he's a sailor, so there's plenty of work for him to do. Yeah, I think that, the other thing I wanted to say is also present at this time were Protestant missionaries, mostly Methodists in the Willamette Valley, and there were Presbyterian Methodists more out on the periphery, like the Whitmans up there near Walla Walla. And they were the ones who really kind of encouraged the Oregon Trail to happen. They kind of came in to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. They had extraordinarily little success doing so. They turned to agriculture. They found that Oregon was a pretty darn good place to grow crops, and word soon got out in the United States that this place, Oregon, wasn't a bad place to farm. So we have sort of these two forms of colonialism, sort of a religious colonialism and a mercantile colonialism at the same time. So what is going to emerge now is settler colonialism. And I'm going to try not to get into too much theory. I explain this to my students as sort of copy and paste colonialism is how I describe this, because unlike those other forms, settler colonialism is really looking to recreate the places of origin of the immigrants sort of in their entirety, and kind of override what's there at the time. And this is why with settler colonialism almost inevitably follows some sort of form of removal of indigenous people, some form of ethnic cleansing. Manifest destiny, right? That's that's really at the heart of settler colonists. They're not here temporarily. They're here permanently. They're here to not to extract resources. Usually, they're here to at least in the case of the Oregon Trail immigrants, be self-sufficient farm families. They don't see any role for indigenous people in this community, and they're going to reproduce place names. I mean, look around Oregon. I'm in Portland. Probably some of you are in Milwaukee. You know, these these are people who are trying to, Portland could have been Boston. There's not a lot of imagination. No one's trying to reinvent the wheel here. Types of agriculture, the types of industry, the types of government, standards of citizenship. Who is a citizen and who's not a citizen? These things all get imported in settler colonialism. And I think settler colonialism ultimately helps us understand the logic behind both not only the removal of indigenous people, but also Black exclusion as well. So the big moment really in early Oregon history is going to be the arrival of whoops, the arrival of approximately 900 people from leaving from Independence, Missouri in May of 1843. It doesn't sound like a lot of people, perhaps to you, considering how sparsely populated Oregon was at the time. This was a huge number of people, and more people would come, and this would indeed change the face of Oregon life. Who were they? Most were really young families, Anglo-Protestant farm families from the old Northwest. They didn't call it the Midwest back then. They called it the Northwest because you remember that map of the country. These are states like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Iowa Territory. And also some of the migrants came from border states like Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee, places that, I mean, slavery is really the issue here with the border states. These are states in which slavery exists, but it's not necessarily the dominant economic form in which there exists a large anti-slavery sentiment among many residents as well, which we'll get into later. Why were they coming? There's a ton of reasons we don't have time to get into today. I think it's important to recognize that while they weren't exactly state-sponsored or organized, they came with a tacit understanding that they would get state support eventually. There had been all these bills in Congress that were supposed to give free land to settlers to cultivate out west. They'd always narrowly failed, but there was this sense that at some point, one of these bills is going to pass and we're going to be able to get a lot of free land out in Oregon. So in order to really, again, to be honest, to take over an area, you need to establish a state, some sort of state apparatus, a government, to really establish a foothold, for a colony to really establish a foothold. And there really wasn't a government beyond the sort of Hudson Bay Company management. There really wasn't a government in non-Indigenous Oregon. So the indigenous communities had their own governments, but there really wasn't any kind of organized non-Indigenous government in Oregon at the time. But people on the ground knew they needed one, and they needed one pronto. So the people who were here, the handful of missionaries, American farmers, people from the fur industry kind of got together and fought over what sort of government they were going to have. The Americans really won out in that. And they established a provisional government in 1843. And again, I have to remind you, Oregon is not part of the United States at this time and won't be for a while. So this is really just a spontaneous creation of a government. In many ways, this government would be kind of a claim club, as you describe it. The chief function of this government is going to be to honor land claims of all of these settlers who are going to be coming out, and that requires recording because it can be chaotic. I would describe land policy in early Oregon. If you ever rented a beach house and watched kids run into a beach house and claim their rooms or claim their beds, that's kind of the way this sort of land claims worked in early Oregon. People rushed in and were claiming things without surveys. There were no surveyors here. They'd put up markers and say, this is mine. So they needed a government to sort of honor these claims. The government would also provide, raise revenue, bounties for certain things, to protect private property, to protect livestock. They needed a government to create a common defense, a militia. Particularly, they were fearing attacks from indigenous communities because this is encroachment. And they also wanted a government, an American-style government, to get ready for potential absorption into the United States. So they would be ready for that process. So again, remember back to copy and paste colonialism. They weren't going to reinvent the wheel. Somebody brought the laws of Iowa Territory, and they basically just copy and pasted the Iowa laws, and those became Oregon's laws. What did this mean? Most importantly, Oregon would be anti-slavery because Iowa was. Also, there was an understanding with the Missouri Compromise that any new territory north of the southern border of Missouri would be a free territory and eventually a free state. Interestingly enough, and this is a topic for further research, no Black exclusion in these original laws, even though Iowa territory had Black codes. They had their own Black exclusion laws. For some reason, this wasn't pasted in, and I think this is interesting. The government did limit voting rights to free male descendants of a white male. So you had to have a white father in order to vote. And this is sort of the reason why they just didn't say white, is because there were those mixed ancestry sons of fur trappers and traders and their indigenous wives. This is probably why that shows up. See. Oh, I just wanted to say, so about those land claims, what this did, basically the Provisional Government granted 640 acres of free land to anyone who came to Oregon. And that was in keeping with a lot of these land bills. We'll get into what an insane, if you know anything about what an acre is, and we'll get into that a little later, it's an insane amount of land to get. And this land was claimed without surveys, but also was completely illegal according to US law, a US precedent, the Constitution. You weren't supposed to claim any land until the federal government came in and extinguished what it called Indian title. And the federal government would have considered Indian title to still be in effect in Oregon at this time. So these original claims are illegal according to, again, US law. Just wanted to take a little aside, because I mentioned anti-slavery residents of Missouri. And I just wanted, this is something I like to talk to my students about, to understand the difference between abolitionism and anti-slavery. They're very different. Abolitionists it was a small, you could even call it a fringe group of activists in the 1830s, the 1840s, who demanded an immediate and unconditional end to slavery everywhere it existed. And most abolitionists advocated for some form of Black citizenship, Black political equality. So that's what an abolitionist is. To be anti-slavery, which is many, many more Americans were anti-slavery than were abolitionists. These are people who had no moral objection to slavery, really. They had an economic objection to slavery. They didn't like the sort of economic system that slavery brought with it. They didn't like the kind of competition that slavery created. They didn't like the sort of social stratification that slavery brought with it. And to understand anti-slavery, they didn't really care that much about slavery in the South. If slavery went on forever in the South, it wasn't really that big of a deal to them. They didn't want it to spread. They didn't want it to be extended to the new territories in the West. Instead, they wanted slavery to sort of be quarantined in the southern states. I mean, this is, if you've studied Abraham Lincoln, this is very much Lincoln's position. Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery all of his life, but he was willing to tolerate slavery continuing in the South until he wasn't. But this was a pretty common position at the time. Politically, the Oregon Trail immigrants were, most of them were members of the Democratic Party. They were Jacksonian Democrats who were anti-slavery. And you might say, wait a minute, that sounds like a contradiction, because if I know anything about Old Hickory, I know that not only was Andrew Jackson pro-slavery, he was a slaveholder himself, but there were many followers of Andrew Jackson, the many Democrats at the time who were anti-slavery. And partly, the breakup of the Democratic Party on the eve of the Civil War, I think, is really probably, that was the Rubicon that pretty much made the Civil War inevitable at that point, when the Democratic Party breaks down over the issue of slavery. So these Oregon Trail immigrants, they didn't like slave labor. They didn't want to compete with slave labor. They didn't want it to draw down wages. They didn't want a wealthy planter class sitting on top of an economy. This is an ideology that was taking hold in the United States that would be known as free labor or free soil ideology. And it's very much related to kind of Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson's vision that the United States, the backbone of the United States, will be these self-sufficient young farm families, and as opposed to, again, the sort of things that Jacksonian Democrats were against. They hated bankers and banks. They hated any sort of government infrastructure programs, taking federal money and using it to build bridges and canals and railroads. They were definitely against that. They're against the urbanization that would bring. They were against tariffs and any kind of sort of protective trade policy. They were against corporations, the fact that the government would charter corporations to serve some sort of function. They were against that. And many Jacksonians were against the Southern planter class itself. I mean, these are anti-elitist, and what is more elite than a Southern planter? So that just sort of explains that contradiction a bit. Okay, I think I'm just checking the time to make sure I'm not going too long on any of this. I think we're good. Oh, just another thing I wanted to say about in Oregon, the presence of slavery extended to the presence of free Black men as well. That there was a sense that any sort of Black person in Oregon, whether free or enslaved, was going to create some kind of permanent underclass. These were settlers who saw Oregon in their sort of copy and paste operation, trying to create an ideal version of the places that they left. They saw Oregon would be a white man's country. It would be free of the issues that were sort of tearing the country apart, which at that time were slavery and the removal of indigenous people. And these are controversial issues at the time. They were tearing the country apart. So just to talk a little bit about Black people in Oregon. There were Black people in Oregon. There weren't many Black people in Oregon in the 1840s, but there were some. Most of them were like Saules. They were either sailors or former sailors. There were also, you see, the woman on the right, that is Mary Jane Holmes Shipley Drake. If you've read Gregory Noakes's book, Breaking Chains, you probably know something about her. She was brought on the Oregon Trail as a child as an enslaved person. And there were Oregon Trail immigrants, migrants who brought their human property with them. And even though Oregon was supposedly anti-slavery, these children had a hard time earning their freedom. And that's what Gregory Noakes's book is about. There was a strange tolerance of actual enslaved people. It was almost like they didn't want slavery, but if there were a handful of slaves in Oregon, that was often overlooked. Oops, let me go back before we get there. So moving towards Black exclusion, I have to return to talk a little bit about James D. Saules and what happened with James D. Saules and how he sort of would inspire the first Black exclusion law. James D. Saules and his friend Winslow Anderson, who was another Black sailor, were involved in what later emerged as a riot in Oregon City in 1844. They weren't really responsible for it, but they were players in this. Some historians claim that this was why Black exclusion was first passed. I don't really buy it, because nobody back then said that that was the reason why they were passing it. But this thing called the Cockstock Affair, in which this Malala man named Cockstock comes to, the authorities are trying to arrest him, and they try to apprehend him, and it breaks out into a riot. He dies. 2 other white settlers die. It's in my book if you're curious about it. It's not really important to us, which is why I'm sort of glossing it over, but I just want to mention it really quick. But what is important, far more important, is in May of 1844, James D. Saules was arrested by Sheriff Joseph Meek for allegedly inciting a group of local indigenous men. I think they might have been Clackamas, I'm not sure, to damage the property and perhaps life, sort of threatened the life of a white settler named Charles E. Pickett, who was a virulent white supremacist from Virginia, who liked to squat on other people's land. I don't know if that had something to do with this dispute, but Saules was arrested. He was tried by an all-white jury, convicted, unsurprisingly, and he was placed in the custody of the Indian agent, Elijah White. So this is interesting. So he wasn't put in the custody necessarily of the local law enforcement with the Indian agent. Oregon had no jails, had no prisons. So Saules stayed at Elijah White's house until he was eventually exiled to the area near Astoria. And after this was carried out, the Indian agent, Elijah White, wrote a letter to the US Secretary of War and asked if it would be legal for Oregon to ban all Black immigration. And he referred to Black residents of Oregon as quote unquote dangerous subjects, which gave me the title of my book. So that's really sort of the what immediately preceded the first Black exclusion law, which we'll talk a little bit about right now. That was the notorious 1844 Lash Law. The Provisional Government didn't wait for any sort of answer from Washington about the legality of Black exclusion. It amended the anti-slavery law to ban not only slaves, but also free Black people. And the punishment for being Black in Oregon, for coming to Oregon while Black and staying here for longer than 3 years, was public flogging of no more than 39 lashes. It was written by that man on the left there, Peter Burnett. Gregory Noakes wrote a book about Peter Burnett as well that I read. And Peter Burnett would later be the first governor of California. Like many people, he took off from Oregon the second they smelled gold down there. And, and that was that for Peter Burnett in Oregon. But he did have time here to write the first Black exclusion law. Now, there was some sort of outcry about the flogging. And I think in the 19th century, that sort of punishment that was so common before, of doing some sort of damage to the body, some sort of dismemberment or maiming of the body, was on the way out and was being replaced by different forms of punishment. So they replaced, interestingly enough, they replaced whipping with a form of indentured servitude, which is really interesting. So if you were found to be a free Black person in Oregon, you were basically forced to become an indentured servant. So that's sort of an interesting anti-slavery law, if you ask me. This original Black exclusion law was repealed in 1845 by a new legislature. And there's a point I think is important here, is that so much in history, in American history in particular, and I try to tell my students, this is contested. many things are controversial. This wasn't like undifferentiated support for these sorts of things. And I think if we're looking for a usable past, I think it's important to look at this fact that there is always, it might be a small minority that's against something, but there were people who were against this sort of thing, but they didn't win out all the time in Oregon. So moving on, let's pull the lens back and talk a little bit about what was going on in the rest of the United States. Black exclusion laws were incredibly common in the entire United States, north, east, south, west. You'll find Black exclusion laws almost everywhere. The reasoning for them is usually quite different. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, all passed Black exclusion laws after they became states. And that gets back to that thing about controversy I was talking about. They waited to become a state and then they passed the laws because they knew that they would be controversial. When you go up for statehood, you have to go before Congress, and there's usually going to be some sort of pushback on this sort of thing. Most of these laws would function sort of as fugitive slave laws in essence. Residents there were trying to prevent any sort of fugitive or emancipated former slave from the southern states from coming up to the north for sort of this, the same reasons I talked about that inspired the Black exclusion laws in Oregon. Most of these states for punishment, to enforce this, they would require huge bonds be paid for good behavior. So if a Black person came to one of these states, they'd have to put up an unbelievable amount of money. They'd usually have to carry some kind of papers to prove that they were free. So these are all ways to dissuade Black people from coming to these, what we now consider Midwestern states. Interestingly enough, they had Black exclusion in the South as well, in the slave states of the South. And most of this targeted Black sailors who Southern politicians and leaders feared Black sailors would leave their ships and instigate problems with the slaves. They would introduce them to abolitionist ideas, give them abolitionist, might bring abolitionist literature with them and start spreading that around. So these Black exclusion laws in the South usually were designed to keep Black sailors on their ships and not allow them to come into the community. Interestingly, with Oregon, we'll see kind of both logics work, because Black sailors will really be the target of a lot of Oregon's Black exclusion laws as well. In 1846, the United States and Great Britain finally settled their dispute over Oregon. It almost went to war. You might remember the phrase 54-40 or fight from your elementary school history classes. I mean, that refers to James K. Polk, the US president at the time, was basically telling Britain that the United States was going to claim all of Oregon up to 54-40, which is the border of Alaska, the southern border of Alaska. Obviously, that was a negotiating tactic. It never came to that, but they settled the boundary where it exists today as the Canadian boundary, and settled it with the treaty. And so now, as of 1846, Oregon is officially part of the United States, but as a unorganized territory, which doesn't mean a heck of a lot. It certainly doesn't mean much money. It doesn't mean, again, it was unsatisfactory for a lot of people living in the area at the time. In 1848, mostly due to increasing tensions with settler encroachment, setting off retaliation from tribes like the Cayuse in the Columbia Plateau region. Oregon wanted money to raise militias. They wanted maybe soldiers, garrisons, forts, infrastructure really for these wars. And the United States agreed to make Oregon an organized territory in 1848. Just a little bit about when they became a territory, there were new laws. Mostly they just kind of grandfathered in all the old stuff from the Provisional Government. In particular, Oregon would continue to be anti-slavery. In September 1849, after the laws were passed, they added a new territorial Black Exclusion Law. And this is interesting. Again, there were, according to census figures, there were 56 people classified as either Black or mixed race living in Oregon in 1850. So again, not a huge population to speak of, and really no indication, especially with the gold rush going on. Not a lot of people were really coming to Oregon when they could go to California and maybe strike it rich. But Oregon felt the need to pass this law, and they had interesting rhetoric around it. Most of it fused kind of fears of those indigenous communities on the periphery, as well as traditional anti-Black racism. The idea here, you see time and time again, is that if free Black people come to Oregon, they will incite the local indigenous population against the white settlers, and there will be violence and bloodshed. This justification shows up again and again and again. Unlike that original Lash Law, this law specifically targets Black sailors, and that's why I was so interested in James D. Saules. And really what this law did is it would punish any sea captain who allowed his Black sailors to leave the ship and kind of mix with the population. So it would punish these captains, which I can only imagine didn't do much to help commerce in the region. But that was the justification for this first law. The law was enforced one time. You know, oftentimes laws don't necessarily need to be enforced to have power. But this law was enforced one time in 1850 against a man named Jacob Vanderpool, who was a Black man. He had come on a ship, like so many Black men had come on a ship to Oregon, and he owned a boarding house and a saloon. And he was arrested for being Black in Oregon and sent away. So that was the only time this law was ever actually enforced. Okay, so we're sort of shifting gears out of my book to the article I wrote, though a lot of this material is covered in my book. And let me just check the time. Okay, I think we're good. The Oregon Donation Land Claim Act. I just want to talk a bit about, I really think that this Oregon Donation Land Act was probably the most effective form of racial exclusion, not just Black exclusion, but racial exclusion in Oregon. It was a bill that was really very similar to those earlier land bills I described, that was going to entice settlers to come to Oregon by giving them unbelievable amounts of land, and then also grandfather in all those original claims that had been made when those first settlers had come to Oregon. So Oregon's territorial delegate, Samuel R. Thurston, who was sort of a non-voting member of the US Congress, he lobbied hard for this bill and got it passed. One thing before I go to the next slide is that it's important to recognize that this bill, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail, would work in conjunction with the removal of indigenous people or from the Willamette Valley. So the idea was that you would have this bill, and then at the same time, you would extinguish all Indian title and move tribes to various reservations, all outside of areas that settlers would have wanted for cultivation. So what did it do? I put this image on here, just talking about an acre. I don't know, perhaps you all are all familiar with what an acre is. Some of my students aren't, and I always use this image that it's not an exact, this shows the size of an acre in relation to a football field. So this gives you an idea of how big these actual land claims were. The Donation Land Claim Act, the DLCA, granted 160 to 640 acres, depending on the timing of when you made your claim, when you came to Oregon, because the law got less and less generous as time went on. And also, if you were married, if you could bring a wife with you to Oregon, she would then get land as well. It wouldn't be necessarily her property, but you could double your land. So a married couple could come to Oregon and claim as much as 640 acres of free land. So this was land that was given to, sorry, just a moment here. The stipulation was every white settler or occupant of the public lands, American half-breed Indians included, we talked a little bit about why that would have been the case, above the age of 18 years, being a citizen of the United States, or having made a declaration according to law of his intention to become a citizen. So you don't even have to be a citizen. You just have to say, I'm willing to become a US citizen as long as you're white. So this is really interesting to me, because so this is actually, you know, whiteness trumps nationality here in terms of being able to claim one of these unbelievably large claims of land. Yes, we did in the chat here. We have the useful information that 640 acres is an entire square mile of land. This image is, I like this image a lot. This is not far from where I grew up. Out Skyline, you see Skyline Boulevard, Cornell, and you see these are all claims, and there's claims throughout the Willamette Valley like this, and you can see that the smaller claims will usually be a single man, and that the names of with the husband and wife are the larger claims. That's how this worked. This was a public-private partnership, you know, that transferred land previously held in common by these indigenous groups. It transferred these lands to private settlers, and this was all done. Again, this was done without any treaties. This land was given away before even treaties were formed or ratified. To borrow a phrase from Ira Katz-Nelson, the political scientist, I refer to this as an affirmative action program for white people. This is the most generous land distribution bill in US history, and is the only one, as far as I've ever found, that is specifically race-based. And this is why I argue that this was probably a far more effective means of not just Black exclusion, but racial exclusion in the region. So why does this matter beyond, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious why it matters. As I said, it's the most generous act in history, and the only one that was race-based. And when the law expired, over 7,000 individuals had claimed 2.5 million acres of Oregon lands from 1850 to 1860. And Oregon's population grew from 12,000 in 1850 to 60,000 in it had grown from 1850 to, it was 12,000 in 1850, it had grown to 60,000 in 1860, which was, it really wasn't quite the number for statehood, but people kind of obviously looked the other way. But it put Oregon on the track to becoming a state. So there was that 1849 Black Exclusion Law was accidentally repealed in 1854 due to some sort of clerical error. I've never been quite sure what happened there. So this wasn't due to anybody having an objection to it necessarily. It was just accidentally repealed. And so immediately lawmakers got together and talked about a new bill. What's fascinating is the bill never passed. In fact, every Black exclusion law, subsequent law, failed. The first in 1855 failed 24-4. In 1856, it failed 23-3. Supporters of these bills continued to make the same sort of argument that, quote, the cross between the Indian and the Negro produces bad blood. That was one quote from a politician about this law, support of this law. Others claimed that Black people had, quote, no right to a part of our inheritance because they had not helped to colonize Oregon. This obviously ignores the existence of James D. Saules and others. Other arguments heard in debate, quote, the United States is a government of white men, unquote. And the Declaration of Independence is a declaration of the equality of free citizenship for white men. So these were the arguments for these subsequent laws. But the law never passed because most people thought it was unnecessary. Delazon Smith was an outspoken white supremacist legislator, said that without the lure of free land, Black migrants would prefer the urban attractions of California over agrarian, isolated Oregon. So they figured they didn't need a law because they'd kind of done the job with this land bill. So Oregon's Black population, we talked about that explosive population growth. It was 50 in 1850. It would grow to a mere 124 in 1860. And that the population would remain incredibly low up until World War II, the World War II population boom. So the Oregon's Black population at the eve of World War II was 0.18%. So in the summer, we're getting very close to the end. In the summer of 1857, Oregon voters sent delegates to the state constitutional convention in hopes of getting congressional approval for statehood. The issues of racial exclusion and slavery were so volatile and controversial that the legislature just decided not to talk about it. They imposed a gag rule and said, we'll just have the voters vote on it. So we won't have to debate it. We'll get the voters to vote on it. We'll just kick it to them. And in November of 1857, Oregon voters voted overwhelmingly to include a Black exclusion clause in Oregon state constitution, as well as banning slavery from Oregon. So again, this was an unprecedented move. No one had tried to do this to get a state constitution passed with Black exclusion in it. It was debated. The issue did come up, but ultimately, with all the other issues going on in the country at the time, the eve of the Civil War, Oregon got its statehood, and Black exclusion, as you probably know, remained on the books long after, decades and decades after it was proven unconstitutional by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So I'm just going to close real quick here. My last slide. Oh, there we have those population numbers. So looking beyond Black Exclusion here. And I think this gets to some other great talks that I would be really interested in. I know that there's people who work on this material, but more the 20th century real estate ramifications of this, because really what the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act is all about is real estate and access to real estate. And real estate, was wealth, and it continues to be wealth today. So I think we can see that this really foreshadows, in addition to dissuading people from coming to Oregon to get this free land, it foreshadows access to real estate and housing as an ongoing means of racial exclusion and segregation. I think we can draw a line from this act to other 20th century practices like redlining, other real estate covenants, other forms of housing discrimination. Real estate is wealth. I read a book where it said 60% of the world's assets are held in real estate. So you think about what a transfer of wealth these original land claims were, and I'm sure anyone who goes to look at this will see that that's how your area began, was with these land claims. I think it really gives you a lot to think about who got what at the time, and how race-based this distribution of wealth was at Oregon's founding. So that's the end of my talk today. How did I do with time? Oh, I went 3 minutes over. I'm sorry about that, but hopefully that's not an issue.
No, and I'm wondering if you have a moment for maybe just a couple of questions that came in the chat.
Yeah, I totally have time.
Great. Well, why don't we aim for just 2 or 3? One, in a couple of slides back, the DLC properties, they weren't in squares. So was there a reason that they were in kind of like odd oblong shapes?
I can only imagine. I've noticed that before. I think I've talked to people about this. It really isn't my area of expertise, is how this stuff was surveyed. Somebody might even know more than I do about it. I imagine some of the land was probably, there might have been a hill or something that no one would have even wanted. I don't know exactly why it was carved up that way. I'm sure it just had to do with the viability of the land, and there could have been water, marshland, or just things that no one would have cared to made claim to. Yeah.
Thank you. And then going pretty far back into the presentation, the anti-slavery movement in Oregon. Tell me, was there much of an abolition movement that took off in Oregon territory ever?
Yeah. My friend, Jim Labey, who would be a great person to talk to on this subject, he's done a lot of work on abolitionism in Oregon. And there weren't a lot of abolitionists in Oregon, but there were some. Tigard, the city of Tigard, I believe that its namesake was an actual honest to goodness abolitionist. I mean, there were various shades of abolitionists. These might not have all been firebrand William Lloyd Garrison or John Brown type abolitionists, but they were fairly remarkable in Oregon at the time. So yeah, there definitely was. And Jim did an article in the same issue that I put my article about the Donation Land Claim Act, and that was the Oregon Historical Quarterly's issue on white supremacy. So I would check out Jim's article on that, because it goes into far greater detail about the abolitionist movement in Oregon. I can say they were roundly despised. They were despised by both, by the Democratic Party, by the Whig Party, and later even the Republican Party, which was ostensibly a anti-slavery party. They didn't like abolitionists. They thought of them as I mean, again, the way that people think of a lot of minority political movements today is overly radical, as not pragmatic, as asking for too much, of asking for unreasonable things. So yeah, they had a rough time of it here, but yeah, they were certainly here.
And then one last question. You're getting a lot of love in the chat box. I want to make sure that you're
Oh,
saying
thank
that.
you.
Definitely not things that were taught in elementary school. That's for sure. Going back, we a ways back got a question on the Lash laws, which I think were 1844.
Mhm.
3 years is pretty arbitrary. Like,
Yeah.
why was somebody allowed to stay for 3 years and then forced out? Was there was that a compromise? Why? How did they land on that?
These are great questions. I relate as a historian of this period. I relate to people who study like Roman and Greek history, where you have like very little evidence to go on, and like we don't have. There was no C-SPAN when this was being. So I would love to have known how they came up, and maybe there's other precedents. I'm sure somebody might even be able to hazard an answer, but it is pretty interesting. Also, it wouldn't have applied to anyone who was already here. None of these Black exclusion laws apply to people who were already here in the area. It was always future immigration was what these things focused on. But yeah, no, I agree. It does seem like a long time.
And finally, this is a question of mine. I really appreciated the connection between the DLCA and redlining. This map that we're looking at right now, do you remember about what year it was? I see it's Portland, I see Irvington.
Oh boy. No, this is on the cover of my students would be upset with me because I always tell them that they need to cite everything, and I just sort of pasted all these images in really quickly. I should have more information on that. This was used as, you can find this if you look up like Oregon redlining on Google Images. I guarantee you this will come up, and this was used. Karen Gibson did an article on this, and she'd probably be a great person to talk to on this if you haven't already had her speak about this topic. But the Oregon Historical Quarterly did an issue on this, and I think this was on the cover or somewhere. So but yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly the date for this.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm gonna pull the screen down, and Eleanor, I'm wondering if you want to take us home.
Almost speechless, which for me is a rare experience. What a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Again, as Cole said, you're getting lots of love in the chat box. Enormous gratitude for helping fill the gap of history that so many of us have was excluded. We were excluded from these truths. Just enormously grateful for that. Again, this is going to be recorded so everybody can listen to it again. I know there was a comment of like, wait, I want to push pause so I can take a note on that. Where's rewind? So understand that people were utterly engrossed in what you're talking about. Back to Oak Lodge Governance Project stuff. We'll have our next speaker on, again, the second Saturday of the month, which will be April 9th. I want to thank you all so much for being here. You can always check out our website and all those good things. Anything else that people want to say? I want to respect everybody's day. Again, thank you all for being here so much. Ken, again, thank you enormously for your contribution to our understanding of the world around us. And provisional government lives on, let me tell you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks.
See you next month.